the presentation fairly quickly to hopefully leave about 10 minutes for questions. As always, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining from today. So I'm on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country down here in Coburg in Melbourne. And I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the elders of the various lands that we're all joining from today and recognise the strength and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, despite the past and present impacts of colonisation and dispossession upon First Nations communities. So thank you again for having me along. As Livia said, I'm Ellen McGregor and I work at Safe and Equal, which is the peak body for specialist family violence services here in Victoria. I work within Safe and Equal's sector development unit, and as Livia touched on, the focus of our work is really on ensuring statewide consistency of practice, supporting our sector with the breadth of reforms that we've seen down here in Victoria since we had our Royal Commission in 2015. A big focus of my role is on supporting our refuge providers. So we convene a forum of refuge providers down here in Victoria called the Statewide Refuge Roundtable, and it's in partnership with the refuge providers that the following piece of work that I'm presenting on has kind of come to be. So down here in Victoria, and I imagine it's the case in New South Wales as well, that family violence refuge is an incredibly scarce resource. We have undergone significant reform and investment in our sector since the Royal Commission in 2015, but despite this, staffed family violence accommodation remains pretty slim on the ground. So pre-Royal Commission, we had approximately 120 households across Victoria in refuge. So that was a mix of communal refuges, dispersed model refuges, and some cluster or core and cluster refuges. One of the findings of our Royal Commission in what was, well, a recommendation from the Royal Commission was to redevelop all of our old communal refuge properties to the core and cluster model. And that process is almost finalised now, and that this redevelopment has included an addition of about 40 households across the state. So we have about 170 refuge households in Victoria now being managed by about 25 refuge service providers. And they are a real breadth of services, some really large faith-based organisations, some of the grassroots women's refuges that opened in the 60s and 70s are still in operation here, and we have a number of ACCO-run refuges as well. So access to refuge in Victoria has historically been via referral from a local family violence service, but refuges also take clients from homelessness services, mental health services. The majority of victim survivors requiring refuge in Victoria are first placed into motel accommodation, and that's a process that's largely managed by our statewide crisis service called Safe Steps, and we also have the Orange Doors, which you may or may not have heard of. Increasingly, local family violence services are also providing motel crisis response within their sort of local council areas as well. And as demand has increased, refuges have identified the need for referrals to be centrally managed and prioritised.
Motionless.
Demand for refuge is huge and continues to steadily increase. I worked at our statewide crisis service during COVID and managed the statewide sort of refuge referral process. And at one time during the pandemic, at Safe Steps alone, we had over 100 families being supported in motel accommodation, and about half of those were families awaiting placement into refuge. So our refuge providers have noted a lot of challenge with referrals coming in from multiple sources. There's a bit of a lack of a shared understanding amongst family violence and other community services of the scarcity of refuge. And we see a lot of what we would call inappropriate referrals. For example, a lot of referrals for people who are homeless due to family violence, but who are not at immediate risk of family violence at the time that the referral is made. And unfortunately, that's how we're triaging now. We'd love to offer refuge to anybody who's homeless as a result of family violence, but we're not in that world, unfortunately, with resourcing. And a lot of inappropriate referrals being sent to refuge providers, for example, referrals of people with mobility issues into refuges that have huge flights of stairs and are not disability friendly, or referrals of very large families into small accommodation options that wouldn't meet their needs. And I guess the biggest issue that we identified down here in Victoria, and it's one that you may have an opportunity to address in New South Wales, is that those most in need of refuge were not necessarily being prioritised because multiple services were all referring into each other and accepting referrals without a statewide picture of risk. So Family Safety Victoria and Safe and Equal, in partnership with our refuge sector, identified an opportunity to sort of streamline the way that clients are referred to and prioritised for refuge. And we've developed what's called the Refuge Eligibility and Prioritisation Framework to ensure essentially that victim survivors who are at the greatest risk of family violence and whose need is highest are prioritised for vacancies in our services. So the framework has been in operation since about January of this year. We've absolutely welcomed it as a sector. It's now the definitive source of policy guidance to specialist family violence practitioners who refer, prioritise and then accept victim survivors into refuge. The framework's objectives are to ensure that victim survivors at the absolute highest risk of significant harm are prioritised for vacancies. There's an intention to improve equity of access and consistency and transparency in the way that refuge places are allocated to victim survivors. And it realises these objectives by creating a shared understanding of the purpose of refuge, the scarcity of refuge, and by streamlining the referral process. Importantly, it's also set expectations of inclusive and intersectional practice approaches from refuge, and it's become this really important lever for Safe and Equal in promoting consistent and inclusive practice across the sector, but I'll talk more on that a little bit later. I'll just very quickly touch on the aspects or the elements of the framework. So the first key piece is the eligibility piece, and as you can see on screen, the victim survivors must be determined to be at serious and imminent risk of significant psychological or physical harm, injury or death from a perpetrator in order to be eligible for refuge. In addition to that criteria, victim survivors also need to have no access to alternative safe accommodation, and they do need to require the additional security features, the intensive face-to-face response, and the supports offered by refuge. Having this articulated in a framework has been incredibly helpful. We've sort of socialised the policy with the broader family violence sector and with community services in Victoria, because I think there's something about the nature of refuge in Victoria where we've been very secret squirrel about our business for a very long time, and the scarcity of refuge has not been well understood. The high security sort of nature of refuge and it really being a necessary protective factor for people of very high family violence risk has also not necessarily been well understood. So it's given us a really good opportunity to embed that understanding broadly. The framework also talks about prioritisation, and the prioritisation is now managed rather than being managed by individual refuges, is now coordinated by our statewide service provider. So under the framework, services all refer to refuge to our statewide crisis service. They have a statewide picture of the available refuge beds and the quantum of people requiring refuge, and they pay very close attention to the dynamic nature of risk being faced by all those victim survivors and prioritise them for vacancies as they arise. So their prioritisation process is absolutely based on the severity of family violence risk, an understanding of the recency and severity of whatever's occurred. There are circumstances related to risk that are not always captured in a risk assessment that are really important to be considered. For example, the broader community context in which the family violence has occurred, any previous system responses that may have failed to prevent a perpetrator's violence, and then, of course, that intensifying, overt, calculating perpetrator behaviours, coercive control. Importantly, the framework also brings to the fore that prioritisation decisions should be informed by other complex life circumstances that may impact a victim survivor and their risk, and that would include things like legal or justice interventions for the victim survivor or the perpetrator, complex life circumstances such as alcohol and other drug dependence or complex mental health needs. All of those things are also factored in to the prioritisation process when determining who needs that really intensive level of refuge support. But family violence risk and the severity thereof absolutely front and centre. So once our statewide provider have developed that picture of risk and are prioritising victim survivors, they start matching them with appropriate refuge vacancies. That's all managed by a piece of software that people maintain, refuge providers maintain. It looks a little bit like Airbnb. And the primary consideration in matching a victim survivor to refuge is their safety. Lots of other considerations go into the matching process, including things like, does this physical space meet the needs of the victim survivors, including any children, disability access and other accessibility features, the level of independent living that someone may prefer or not prefer, and the cultural safety considerations for people from marginalised communities, including LGBTQIA+ people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients, and people from migrant backgrounds. Noting that we have a breadth of refuge service providers who some of whom have a specialism in some of those areas. And all of the matching is underpinned by an acknowledgement of victim survivor choice wherever possible, noting that there's often not a lot of choice when you're one of 30 people on a wait list for a refuge and a vacancy comes up, once a week. One of the things that's worth mentioning is the Royal Commission into Family Violence noted the importance of ensuring victim survivors can receive the safety response that they need when fleeing violence, while also staying connected to their local community, to support networks, education and employment and things. And historically, we have tended to place victim survivors very far away from their unsafe areas, so what we would determine to be unsafe areas for them. That practice is shifting a little bit because of this framework, and wherever possible, we're now seeking to accommodate people closer to their supports, but there's always a need to balance that with an understanding of perpetrator behaviour and risk and how well protective factors can keep somebody safe. But yes, wherever possible, we're trying to maintain connection to community, education, even just proximity to friends and family for victim survivors needing secure accommodation. So most importantly, from my perspective, the refuge framework has really provided us with an opportunity to take stock of and better embed a really deep understanding of intersectional practice into our refuges here in Victoria. The framework acknowledges that different aspects of a person's identity can expose that person to overlapping forms of discrimination and marginalisation. And historically, our services have been largely for cisgendered women and children only. We're on a bit of a journey as a sector in terms of broadening our definition of victim survivor to be more inclusive of people of all genders and sexualities. Many of our services have operated under a zero tolerance policy around alcohol and other drug use for a very long time. And many of our services have also felt not well equipped to manage really complex mental health and suicidality, for example, in a refuge setting. our framework sets the expectation that refuge providers acknowledge that these things form a part of an experience of family violence, and that they acknowledge different aspects of a person's identity and are inclusive and non-discriminatory in responding to the needs of what we know a really diverse cohort of people. So Safe and Equal's been doing a huge amount of work to help our sector align their eligibility, intake and case management practices to the intersectional approach within the framework. We've been partnering with targeted services to build capacity, working with victim survivors who may have historically faced barriers to refuge. So at the moment, we're developing a co-case management model between Specialist Family Violence Services and our peak body for alcohol and other drug services here in Victoria, and we're working really hard to embed a harm minimisation approach across all of our refuges. We're working closely with mental health services in Victoria to capacity build around managing complex mental health in a family violence accommodation setting, including managing suicidality and self-harm behaviours. We've partnered with Rainbow Health Victoria to develop an inclusive practice guide for refuges who are seeking to extend their definition of victim survivor to include people of diverse gender identities, noting that many of our refuges will choose to apply their equal opportunity exemption and remain a service for women. There are also services who are now seeking to accommodate, trans women, trans non-binary people. We've run a pilot of refuges accommodating gay men alongside victim survivors, and that's been really, gay male victim survivors alongside other victim survivors, and that's been a really wonderful project to be a part of. We're partnering with JIRA, our family violence service for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Victoria, to develop a cultural safety framework for our refuges. And we've also importantly had some discrete funding provided to build capacity for refuges in accommodating victim survivors with pets. I guess what's been a privilege in undertaking all of this work is it's given us an opportunity to really strengthen an intersectional feminist approach to practice that really acknowledges the impact of systemic discrimination on the lives of victim survivors and doesn't create additional barriers to their accessing accommodation and support where they may have existed in the past. And we're really keen to resist this idea of intersectionality as a category of person. Like, I've heard some people out in direct practice say, oh, that's an intersectional client because that person is Aboriginal and a lesbian. We're really deeply seeking to resist that. And this framework has given us an opportunity to promote a really deep understanding of how intersectionality can be used as an analytical framework for understanding power, and a lens through which to examine how a person's, social identities combine to create experiences of privilege or discrimination for them. So massive brain dump and a lot of information in a short amount of time, and I'll provide these slides so that they can be shared. But I think I'm very keen to discuss further, take any questions that you may have, noting that there's probably a lot that New South Wales can take from a Victorian context, including some lessons about how to articulate who you are and what you're doing off the bat early on in, defining who your client group is, the level of risk that they need to be at to access your service, and then in setting expectations for your service providers around providing that deeply intersectional response. But I note that I've gone my full 20 minutes, half an hour. So I'll pause for some quick questions, and I'm also really happy to just pop my details in the chat. And if anybody has any questions about the content from today, or you want to see a copy of the framework itself, very happy to share. And I'll just stop sharing my screen. And I don't know if I can see who popped their hand up first. I don't know if you saw.
Hi, Ellen. I think I just wanted to say thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation, and it's so important, I think, for us here in New South Wales to kind of hear about what's happening in the Victorian context with Core and Cluster specifically, because you've been doing it for a few years already. We're still very much kind of at the bricks and mortar procurement stage. So it's really fantastic to hear, particularly about the eligibility and prioritization and intersectionality. It's really exciting. So I will pass over for some questions. Hannah, did you have your hand up for a sec before?
Sorry, I meant to clap.
Oh,
Had a tick, but
okay. Well then, I will pass over to Rebecca, who has her hand raised.
Did you speak to Deborah after her email this morning?
Called me.
hi
Okay,
everyone.
cool.
Sorry.
So do they have information on the
I was really
project?
interested in the eligibility and prioritization, and possibly hearing more around that. I guess my gut reaction is that the victim survivor knows their situation a lot of the time better than we do, and I also recognise and wondered about how that isn't on a linear model. It moves up and down. So I guess I was a little bit, it didn't necessarily feel quite right for me in that regard. I guess we we do some of that mitigation and looking at that risk, and but also recognising that it can go from threat to serious threat within a day. So I guess that was just made me really curious. We're really fortunate that we do have Core and Cluster in Orange in New South Wales, and have been working, and I was so excited to see the work that we believe that we're doing put into words by you, in that we do look really closely at the client and how we can support those intersections within the work that we do, and guide them in their stay. So we're not as we're very hesitant to go down the path of continuing homelessness. So how can we continue that stay effectively and safely from with all of those intersections at play? So I was really excited to see that.
it's great. I can probably touch on your question around the dynamic nature of risk, and that's so. In prioritising victim survivors for risk, we largely use our Victorian Marram risk assessment framework. When a victim survivor is referred into Refuge and are placed on the wait list for Refuge, our statewide service provider who's managing the prioritisation stays in very close contact with both the victim survivor and whichever service is case managing them to stay updated about the nature of risk. And our framework prioritises victim survivor self-assessment of risk as the biggest sort of piece of our structured professional judgment. So we're very much guided by victim survivors' own assessment of what's happening and how needed that refuge is. The work of managing, of keeping abreast of all of that dynamic risk is incredibly challenging. And it was part of the job of my team when I worked at the statewide provider, was to, be liaising with services and victim survivors across the board to keep that contemporaneous information up to date. We had a team of about, I think it was about 14 brief intervention case management staff who focused very much on that work, and they remain doing that now. So it's a hard thing to do, to manage that prioritisation process. It requires a lot of resourcing, and we're lucky that down here Family Safety Victoria have understood the importance of that and invested in it. And I don't know whether you'll walk down the path of having that statewide prioritisation approach, but whether you do or you don't, it's great for you for refuge providers to have clarity on your eligibility requirements and to be able to speak to the very specific purpose of family violence refuge and how high the high risks of the family violence that we're trying to mitigate with these sort of accommodation options. yeah, the intersectional approach and meeting a victim survivor where they're at, trying to meet their needs as best as possible. It's been a lovely process to be part of and to help our services kind of improve their practice. There's been no resistance, no backlash to any of the change. It's really just a capacity building effort for us at this point for services that have historically been quite narrow in their thinking around their client group, to help them, build capacity to open that door a bit wider. And it's great that you have the opportunity with lots of new core and clusters being built to get that thinking in place and that intersectional lens embedded from the get-go. I've probably run out of time, haven't I, Olivia? So I'll zip it unless there's any more questions.
Thanks, Ellen. No, I think you're absolutely right, though, when talking about that prioritisation, because I'm not sure here in New South Wales what the process will be. Obviously, refuges are for people who are at the extreme end of risk. And so I think there'll be a central kind of referral line, but it sort of remains to be seen how it's going to be handled here. Does anyone else have any questions? I don't see any hands up, and there's nothing new in the chat box.